Okay, well, now it's been what, 3 weeks since we read this chapter. Um,
Yeah.
I can remember more or less what I wrote here. And then, as I said, I put a few things, some extra thoughts that aren't contained in the chapter. I've been trying to uh, become fluent in possible world semantics, which I can talk a little bit about.
Mm,
And that's a side project. I don't know necessarily whether or not it's the best way to model the specific claim that Hegel makes with respect to Fichte regarding self-identity and that kind of thing. But I'm working on possible world semantics now, and I wanted to use it to see if I could model what was going on. And I think that it does, to a
mm,
certain extent, help to think through some of the interesting um, incompatibilities uh, in different frames of thinking about the relationship between self-identity and uh, a normative imperative. Um, I'll talk about that in more depth later on, but the main thing is that there's a claim that in the chapter on Fichte, Hegel is quoted as saying, in Fichte, ego equals ego means ego ought to be equal to ego.
mm,
And there's some kind of interesting things about that split apart the difference between necessary truth versus obligation,
yeah.
and that there are certain things that follow from necessity understood in terms of truth
hmm
versus necessity understood in terms of obligation. Not all of the same premises follow
Yeah.
from both. And so it's kind of interesting to look at that. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that, kind of modeling what's going on. But maybe we can just finish up the chapter on Hegel and work out a few things that were left hanging last time.
Yeah.
Uh, you want to recap what you remember, what we
Yeah.
covered, what you remember from the chapter, etc.?
Yeah. I guess the main thing that I took was Hegel's critique of the previous philosophies being two square
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
and literally two, right? With
Well,
Aristotle and stuff.
yeah, unpack that word square. What's going on with that? What do you mean square?
Um, so when it comes to just categorizing things in the world and or also just talking about like subjects and predicates. We spoke about determinability.
About what?
Determinability,
Determinability. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that when you pose a thing or a subject, there's this infinite possibilities already sort of um, not brewing, but yeah, that's manifest in the subject, I guess.
Hmm.
That um, so when you say I, or let's say when you say it already has like this sort of energy or um, of like infinite predication in it already. And then when you affirm a certain predicate to a subject, you are also sort of disregarding all the other set of predicates that you haven't assigned it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, well, there's this idea that, at least from my mom, the idea that to be a subject is to itself be a self-determining synthesis. Well, maybe self-determining is not quite the right word because, as you said, the property of determination is just modal there. It's not actually been determined yet. Its property, the property of the subject, the necessary, I guess, tautological property of the subject is that it is determinable, has
yeah,
the potential, the open-endedness to be determinate, etc. Yeah. Uh,
and
yeah, go ahead.
so I guess Hegel's critique is that um, all of these philosophies are not dynamic. Um,
Yeah.
And so he's, I think, trying to create a philosophy where it's sort of a continuous unfolding of the relations between the subject and the predicates. And
Yeah, and I think that that idea of I might be asked to leave. We'll see. Oh, no, it looks like I'm safe. Hopefully, people won't come in this room at any point. But if they do, I'll move somewhere else.
yeah.
Um, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, yeah. It's this idea of dynamism understood in terms of continuity, right?
Mhm.
That is to say that one thing that you might say about, say, Aristotelian or on Hegel's view, Kantian logic is that there's something atomistic about it, perhaps, that the basic logical operations are perhaps distinct from one another. They, in some sense, are perhaps arbitrarily thrown together, right?
Mhm.
And what Hegel, in this idea of making logic dynamic or reason dynamic or whatever, is that he wants there to be a strong sense of necessary connection between the elements of logic, right? So, like the idea with the table of categories in Kant, right, was that one thing Hegel objects to is that it just seems like a bag of logical operations,
Mhm.
essentially, right? It doesn't seem that there's any necessary connection between, say, um, the categorical judgment and the problematic judgment, or I think last time I said the hypothetical and the infinite or whatever. I mean, it just seems like an extensional list of logical
Mhm.
operations without there being any kind of connecting fiber. And the connecting
Mhm.
fiber can be understood as a a sort of necessary entailment, actually, right? This idea that you can derive all of the categories of the understanding from one initial category, perhaps
Mhm.
affirmation, or if not one, then at least a kind of generative dyad of opposites, right? So, in the science of logic, he starts with affirmation, but then shows that affirmation has the dual aspect. So pure affirmation. I'm trying to decide whether I want to give the logical steps. Right now, I'll just assert that logical affirmation, pure affirmation, or what he actually calls pure being, is identical, or at least is, yeah, I would say is coextensive with pure negation. What I mean by that is that pure affirmation and pure negation are essentially have the same definition, um,
Mhm.
but they're understood under different aspects. One is positive, one is negative. What I mean by that is he goes through this in a lot more steps, but what I'll say is simply like imagine being that has no content, right? It's just pure being, not being of something, but just pure being as
Mhm.
pure affirmation
Yeah.
exists, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So what we see there is essentially that it's an empty container. It has a kind of limitation to it, but there is no content to it. It's just sort of pure abstract empty being.
Mhm.
Um, but then you can also look at negation, nothing, as itself also the positing of a pure empty container, nothing.
Mhm.
The idea being
Mhm.
that at that most general abstract level, affirmation and negation sort of, if you're going to try to define them extensionally, they have the same extension, right? An empty container,
Yeah.
right? However,
Mhm.
intentionally, they're
Mhm.
not the same because one has the function of affirmation, one has the function of negation, right? But you can
Mhm.
see that on one level, you can say that from that idea of the dynamic aspect of logic being this sort of idea of entailment, there's a sense in which you can derive negation from affirmation, but you can also derive affirmation from negation.
Mhm.
In other words, you posit pure. contentless being. Um, but in doing that, what you have also done, by virtue of the fact that it is a contentless positing, you
Yeah.
have also just posited nothing.
Yeah.
Understood now not as the absence of something entirely, but rather as sort of like the infinite judgment, the affirmation or the positing of an absence, of an emptiness, something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
And so there you can see that it's maybe not totally apt to say that you derive negation from affirmation, because you could just as well start with negation, I suppose.
Hmm.
Although maybe not, because it does seem like at the very least you have to posit something. And you
Yeah.
can't, there's a sense where if you start with negation, how would you ever be able to posit in the first place?
Yeah.
But once you
Hmm.
have posited pure being,
Mm.
you now have the capacity to posit something that has basically the same extension,
Yeah.
emptiness or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like the empty set or something.
Mm.
I suppose one way to say it is that both pure being and and the pure being and the positing of nothing could both be expressed by the empty set,
Mm.
right? That's one way of looking at it, maybe
Yeah.
extensionally, right? It's like, well, they're both the empty set because one is the brackets, but there's nothing in it, and the other is the nothing, but with brackets around it.
Yeah.
But extensionally, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
However, in terms of I say their intention, the what we do with them, or what they mean, or by virtue of what um, is the empty set either a way of defining pure being versus pure nothing, they differ, right? Like I
Mm.
suppose you could say that pure being, even though it's the same extension, pure being is aptly described by the empty set by virtue of the brackets.
Yeah.
And I suppose that pure nothing is also as a positing uh, expressible by the brackets, but there's more emphasis on the actual content between the brackets, the nothing,
Yeah.
right? But the point is simply that you can either derive one from the other, negation from affirmation, or perhaps you posit them both together as essentially being coextensive, but with different aspects. And then what he describes in the science of logic is this idea that pure being as a positing constantly gives way to pure nothing, but then pure nothing as a positing constantly gives way to pure being, because
Mm.
pure nothing, another aspect to it is pure being. And pure
Yeah.
nothing, or sorry, I don't remember what I said. Pure being, one aspect of it, the same thing, but understood as actually, we haven't even gotten the word thing yet. The same positing or
Yeah.
whatever under a different aspect is negation, and negation under a different aspect is affirmation. And so you can see them as being this sort of constant unity of opposites or something that
Mm.
understood atomistically, you would just have the nothing and the something, and they would constantly fall into each other.
Mm.
But then what he says is that, and I don't remember how he grounds this claim, but essentially, you can posit both the being and the nothing in this constant sort of cyclical nature together uh, in a unity which is becoming, which is to say the synthesis of the being and the nothing, such that you get something generative out of it, right?
Hmm.
So that it's not just, this constant cycle of essentially emptiness, right? Empty being versus posited nothing or whatever that just continues indefinitely with no progress, rather um, understood together as a positing, you get becoming, which is essentially the union of the pure being and the nothing, right? But
Mm.
that gives you a little bit of the flavor for what's going on, right? Instead of just saying, well, we've got an affirmative judgment and we've also got a negative judgment. They have different structures and so on. What he's trying to do is show that you can essentially derive the categories one from the other in a sequence,
Uh-huh. Right.
right?
Okay.
Um, yeah, and so that gives you an idea for what the that idea of um of continuity or dynamism is doing because it's treating these logical operations not just as kind of logical atoms that aren't necessarily connected to each other. You know, they might be the complement of each other or whatever, but you can't really derive one from the next, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or derive one from the last and so on. But Hegel is claiming you can, and he actually goes through the entire table of categories doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although he starts to give them different names and claims that they designate different kinds of functions of thought and so on. But the thing is that he wants to say that Kant just sort of arbitrarily chose quantity as the first category to start with. Um, but there's no particular reason for that. I mean, Kant sort of gets away with it because he isn't interested in providing a defense for how you can derive one category from the others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
he just starts arbitrarily with quantity, according to
Mm-hmm.
Hegel anyway. But Hegel wants to say, no, actually, I can derive all of the categories of the understanding from the first moment in the qualitative judgment affirmation.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why he reorders the categories. Kant lists them quantity, quality, relation, modality, but Hegel switches around quantity and quality and starts with quality as a way of deriving everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Like in the positing, um, so if it's yeah, if the affirmative or the quality comes first, you can also see how it's a quantity because it's a positing at something, so there must be some quantity, right? One or many or whatever.
Yeah, actually, so right. So he gets I don't remember all the steps. It's been a couple of years since I looked really closely at this, but yeah, he gets to becoming, but it's still just pure contentless becoming. It's like the logical
Mm.
structure of becoming or something. And then he gradually, but with becoming, one thing that you have necessarily is uh, a judgment or an operation or whatever that points towards same and other, right? Because the
Mm.
idea of, I mean, becoming is essentially this idea of self-othering, right? Like you start at state A, but gradually A others itself and becomes state B. Actually, at this point, we don't even have state names like state A and state B. It's just the pure idea of becoming posits um, uh, and other.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that that means is that you get um, this distinction between something and some other thing, right? This idea
Yeah.
that there's this something that comes out of becoming. In any case, he gradually moves on from becoming to becoming something and then becoming determinate and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But yeah, that's how he starts to derive everything. The main point is simply that, you know, he starts with a basic kind of seed,
Yeah.
the affirmative judgment that then uh, he attempts to derive everything else from. And so that's the sort of unified element of it. But it also has this strong sense of necessity to it because what he wants to show is that um, not only can you link one moment to the next or one judgment to the next, but there's something necessary about the very idea of one judgment that brings about the possibility of the next judgment,
Mm-hmm.
right? Anyway, I mean, the science of logic is 800 pages, and
Oh.
I've described what goes on in about the first 3 or 4 pages. But it gives you an idea for the difference between Kant's categories and the way that Hegel deals with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, right. And so let me think about what we didn't cover last time. I mean, there is some interesting stuff here. Reason is a dynamic unfolding process, not just a symmetrical table of disconnected judgments.
Mm,
And this gives you a different understanding of reason away from I mean, it's a little bit of a caricature to talk about Kant as being, very far over on, say, the Platonic side of things. But there does seem to be a sense in Kant that's borrowed from Plato, which is this idea of truth as understood in geometric terms,
mhm,
right? Which he kind of borrows from the classical tradition. Whereas Hegel, in deriving necessarily one judgment from the last or one form of consciousness from the last and so on, has this sense of directed growth. In other words,
mhm,
teleology, right? And so that's
mhm.
the teleological aspect of Hegel's approach to judgment. Let's see. We talked about language as being a material manifestation of reason. Um, And we talked about this distinction between predication and identity, that the subject is always more than its its predicates because it's that function that unifies the predicates that enables them to actually inhere in a substance.
Mhm.
Uh, let's see. One thing we didn't talk about last time, which I think is kind of interesting, is talking about the material expressions of the negative infinite judgment. So,
Ah, okay, great.
maybe you can just summarize, first of all, what the negative infinite judgment is in Hegel, as opposed to in Kant, the infinite judgment, which has the moment of negation in it as a prefix, the non. What's going on with these material expressions of the negative infinite judgment, and how does he get that out of the logic of the infinite judgment?
I don't know what the word material means here, material expressions. But I remember,
Well, I'll just define that,
uh,
I guess. It means real. It means not merely uh, logical, virtual, not merely possible, but actual,
oh, I see. Okay.
right? In other words, if I say that, S is non-P, that isn't about anything.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like there are S's is non-P's floating around in the world materially.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
that's the way material is being used here. It's talking about how the logic of the negative infinite judgment is expressed in the material world.
Mhm. Okay. Um, yeah, from what I remember from the last time, in a negative, well, Hegel is saying that in the negative judgment already there is this idea of infinity, right? That when you say S is not P, um, you have only denied that particular predicate to the subject, and
Hmm.
but there's all these other infinite predicates that's also simultaneously being affirmed when you say S is not P.
Yeah, actually, one thing that I think the step that links them, I think, is supposed to be that there's at least one interpretation that holds that the negative judgment means the same thing on a grammatical level as the infinite judgment. In other words, that S is not P means the same thing as S is non-P.
Mm,
Um, but the S is non-P is kind of a pivot in a way because it can mean the same
yeah.
thing as, but it also conceals an element of affirmation,
Hmm.
right? And so that's how he gets the infinite judgment out of the negative judgment. It's not just that, the negative judgment fully contains the infinite judgment. It's that the infinite judgment, I think, acts as a pivot, right? So that
Yeah.
you can interpret it as meaning the same thing as, at least grammatically. But of course, Hegel claims that an inadequate formulation of reason is never merely grammatical.
Mm,
There's always some material correlate or material content to adequate reason. In
mm,
other words, like the material expressions of abstract logical forms are always closer to the nature of spirit or the nature of the truth than a merely abstract logical form.
hmm.
I- Is it clear what I'm saying there? I mean, we talked about that with respect to his approach to language as being what is more adequate to the truth or to the nature of spirit or whatever, some universal but abstract logical form, or the corresponding logical form as it's actually used in real language,
Yep.
right?
Right. So that's the
So,
pragmatic part.
yeah, exactly. So there's a connection to pragmatism there, but it's this idea that um, spirit in itself discovery or its increasing self-understanding um, begins to understand itself or see itself, or even to a certain extent, I suppose, give rise to expressions in the material world. And
Yep.
so that those are further along the process of spirit's development than the merely abstract. And so, like, for instance, if we go back to the first judgments in the science of logic, those are completely abstract and not
Hmm.
very developed, right? It's
Yep.
just they're empty, they're the dead bones of sort of pure logic, but they're not true in the way that a material expression of them would at least be closer to the true than
Yeah.
the merely abstract formulation of it.
Yeah.
Right. So, um, trying to remember why I brought that up. It has to do with how you get from, oh yeah, that's right. So, there is a grammatical way of reading the infinite judgment as just meaning the same thing as the negative judgment.
Hmm.
S is non-P just means S is not P, right?
Yep.
But I think Hegel is committed to saying that if there is an interpretation of S is non-P that is distinct from S is non-P, or S is not P rather, that can be expressed in a material way, then that's enough to call it a new form of judgment. That's not
Yeah.
just the negative judgment, right?
Yeah.
And so, in the outline here, um, yeah, it's under my initials in under the dynamic of judgment, its progressive forms, and then in number three, the infinite judgment. I say this, since for Hegel, logical form is dependent on content. That is to
Hmm.
say, the pure logical form is just kind of empty, abstract, dead. The living logic is dependent on content. And since an understanding of the infinite judgment, so okay, maybe I'll go back a step here. In the infinite judgment section here, I say that, S is not P or S is non-P, where S and P are not meaningfully related.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, the thing is that S is not P can be understood as true in sense making, like the dog is not a chihuahua, but that's just a negative judgment.
Hmm.
So the real adequate formulation of number two is going to be, or of S is not P is going to be number two, where it's true but nonsensical, because that's something that is not just exhausted by the negative judgment. There's
Yeah.
something different about that. And since I say this, since for Hegel, logical form is dependent on content, and since number two is distinct from other stages of negation, the two is the adequate form of the negative judgment. I guess what I'm saying there is that there are different ways in which, I guess you could look at it in two different ways. We don't even have to talk about material expressions of it yet. We can simply say that understanding S is tilde P um, with respect to number two gives it different content than if we just understand it as number one,
Yep.
right? Like there's different propositional content to that, right?
Yep.
And so because of that, because S is not P can have two different kinds of propositional content, I think Hegel is justified or at least motivated to call it a different kind of judgment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say in that
Mm.
little note there. Um,
Right.
yeah, so, but the idea is that the negative infinite judgment comes out of the negative judgment because it's sort of a pivot where it has, in some sense, the same grammatical form as, same basic logical form, but its content can differ. It
Hmm.
can mean something different,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
is what justifies calling it a different kind of judgment, the infinite judgment, instead of just a negative judgment.
Yeah. So I guess this is like sort of the again leads back to Kant's a critique of Kant's logic, where it's more centered around the form of judgments as opposed to content, right? And maybe that's why Kant did not figure this out.
Maybe the thing is that Kant does distinguish between the negative and the infinite judgment. And
Mhm.
he doesn't exactly try to derive the infinite judgment from the negative judgment, but he does say that it carves out a different sort of shape in logical space from the negative judgment,
Mm.
right? So he does distinguish. The real distinction between Kant and Hegel here is whether it is necessary that one derive the infinite judgment from the negative judgment. So Hegel is deriving it as it's sort of like it's not exactly like a subset of the negative judgment, because then the negative judgment could entirely encompass the infinite judgment, but it's like a pivot. It permeates the negative judgment by having the same basic grammatical or logical form, but having different content.
Hmm.
So it like has one foot in the negative judgment, but emerges into something else.
Yeah. And so
Judgment.
he doesn't need to use the word non, I guess, because
Yeah, I guess that's not immediately. Yeah, I don't think you can get there immediately from that inference, but I think it's related. I guess the reason he doesn't need a non is because, like Maimon, he thinks that judgments um, are only adequate with respect to content, right? That's the whole
mm,
idea with the transcendental is prior to the general logic. Right,
mm,
that actually there's something more adequate about transcendental logic because of the way it
hmm,
brings content in, but then that also means that it's dependent on its content for its distinctions,
yeah,
right? But the way that Maimon gets rid of the non is by appealing to the content of the subject and predicate concepts, right? So that even though the form is affirmative, there's a mismatch, there's a kind of negation in the incommensurability of the subject and the predicate term.
hmm,
The way he says it is that where the negative judgment gives a reason to deny, so there is a positive aspect to the negative judgment, it gives a reason to deny, or at least it
hmm,
assumes a reason to deny, but the infinite judgment does not assume a reason to deny.
mm,
So, or maybe we could say it this way, which makes it even a little bit clearer. The negative judgment gives a reason not to affirm the predicate of the subject, but the infinite judgment does not give a reason to affirm,
hmm, hmm,
right? But there you see exactly the same structure, right?
yeah,
That the non is changing position.
right,
I give a reason not to affirm is negative. I don't give a reason to affirm is infinite.
yeah,
Right? The reason for bringing the predicate together with the subject, right?
right,
And so I think that he just borrows that entirely from that tradition, Maimon through Fichte, Schoen, and so on.
hmm,
Yeah, but I guess the one thing to say about the adequacy of the infinite judgment as a real kind of judgment as opposed to negative, what he's saying here is really when you appeal to content, um, it refutes the various commentators on Kant that have said that Kant was just kind of obsessed with geometry and wanted to have a symmetrical table where every category had three divisions and all this kind of stuff. And so just throws in something that is synonymous with the negative judgment, the infinite judgment.
yeah,
Hegel is like Kant, say, no, actually, there is something special that the infinite judgment is doing, but you have to look at it with respect to the content,
Mm,
right? What it
mm.
means, essentially, as opposed to just what its pure logical form is.
Yeah. Yeah. When you just gave that example with reason, um, seems like when that, or how do I say it? Like, it's always the reverse of the logical structure, like, right? So when you say, what did you say? You said for the negative judgment, S is not P, you give a reason not to affirm.
You do give a reason not to affirm. Yes.
You do give a reason not to affirm, right? Oh, okay.
But with the
Yeah.
infinite, you do not give a reason to affirm.
Yeah.
The consequence of that is that you also do not give a reason not to affirm. But the real important thing in the infinite judgment is putting the not on the reason part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, having a reason to say no versus not having a reason to say no, but also not having a reason to say yes. And
Yeah.
that's why yes and no can be identical
Right.
in the infinite judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and then into the this idea of the material expressions of the negative infinite judgment. I'm looking at this outline and I'm realizing that there's no necessary connection between, the last section of the outline and this thing on material expressions of the negative infinite judgment. But, it's another way of describing this basic conceit in Hegel, which is that the various forms of spirit take shape in material, in the material world and in material expressions and so on.
Hmm.
Um, but do you want to see if you can explain what's going on and why he takes crime and death to be two expressions of the negative infinite judgment, S is
Hmm.
non-P?
Yeah. Death negates not just health, but huh. Yeah. So okay, if you just took the concept of death,
Actually, I think maybe one way to get at it, just take these as examples, but I think like on a kind of structural level, one way to get at it is to think about what is going on with reason in
mm,
Maimon's formulation of the infinite judgment, right? So you're either within the sphere of reason when you have a reason to deny P of S, you're in
yeah.
the sphere of reason. But
Hmm.
when you deny the sphere of reason, you don't have a reason, then you're doing something different.
Yeah.
You're making a claim that is outside the sphere of claim making. We froze. Oh, no,
Yeah.
we froze. Did you hear what I just said?
Yeah. We're outside the sphere of claiming.
Well, yeah, exactly. You can also
Yep.
kind of think about it with like random, right? And this idea
Hmm.
that when you make claims, there's a kind of game going on, which is to say
Hmm.
there's a sphere that these sentences have a sort of power or have a sort of use or a sort of meaning or whatever, but it's only really within that sphere
Yeah.
that they have that.
Hmm.
And that's the claim making game, right? The inference game or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What Maimon is saying here is that look, in a negative judgment, you're still playing the game of giving and taking reasons.
Yeah.
And you're saying, I have a reason to say P doesn't fit S.
Yeah.
But when you make an infinite judgment, you aren't playing the game anymore
Hmm.
because you're saying, no, I don't have a reason. In fact, perhaps I couldn't have a reason. And in other words, what you're doing is negating the very sphere of reason itself, or you're
Right.
negating the inference game itself.
Yeah.
And that's presumably why they come across as paradoxes
Hmm.
or nonsense or whatever,
Yeah.
because nonsense can't be fit to the sphere of reasons, given and
Yeah.
taken reasons. It is sort of interesting understood from a kind of pragmatic perspective that perhaps what infinite judgments do is connect language to other non-linguistic activities, like taking things to be beautiful or
Yeah.
something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but in any case, I think you can see what's going on with Hegel here in these material expressions of the negative infinite judgment exactly in that way that what they do is negate a sphere within
Hmm.
negate a sphere within which there are kind of two possibilities of negation, right? Within the sphere, within any sphere, any kind of law governed, um, rule governed sphere, there's always the possibility to confront, like in the case of logic or whatever, you can always negate within the sphere. But I suppose another sort of negation, although not a true negation that's rule governed, is to deny the very sphere itself.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what's going on here. So you want to
Yeah.
try to put some of this in your own words and then say why crime or death would be good examples of the negative infinite judgment in material form?
Mm. Hmm. Um, okay, so another thing is that when you deny the sphere, you're still that is also occurs within the sphere itself, right? You're in the game still, but you're denying the game. Is like what
Well,
I'm.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose I guess it depends on whether the negative infinite judgments in Hegel or the thetic judgments or whatever, even if they're expressed positively, whether um, you could say it this way, whether there is logical closure. What I mean by logical closure is can they entirely be contained within the sphere?
Yeah.
Or does the denial of the sphere mean that they are necessarily open, at least with respect to the sphere? Right? In other words, what I mean, usually when people talk about closure, there are all sorts of different kinds of closure, like metaphysical closure or epistemic closure or whatever. It basically means that um, say some assertion or something like that is entirely contained within the sphere in which it's being made. So if I talk about like the metaphysical closure would, if I have an epistemology that allows for metaphysical closure, one thing I can say is that there are certain assertions that are metaphysically certain. They're entirely contained within the metaphysics I'm using. But if I
Mm.
have non-closure or openness, if something's metaphysically open, it means, let's say I have an epistemology that's metaphysically open, it means that I can't get certainty.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could have an epistemology where certain claims have metaphysical closure, certain claims don't have metaphysical closure, or you could have an epistemology where there is absolutely no metaphysical closure.
Hmm.
Right, but this idea of closure means that it's contained entirely within the sphere that is defined, in this case, a certain metaphysics or something. Right.
Yeah.
So if you're saying, that the infinite judgments are still contained within the sphere of reason, then you're saying that, um, uh, at least with respect to the sphere of reason, they have that kind of closure. In
Mm.
other words, it's always possible to say whether a statement of nonsense is true or false. You just call it false, for instance. That would mean that you can kind of close off the infinity of the infinite judgment with respect to the sphere of reason.
Hmm.
Because one thing about a nonsensical paradoxical argument is if you say it's just false, then it's still contained within the sphere of reason. But then it's
Yeah.
also not an infinite judgment, it's just a negative judgment.
Yeah.
But if you say it's neither true nor false, oh, now it's not closed, at least with respect to the sphere of truth functionality, right?
Yeah.
Because it can't be contained
Yeah.
by the sphere of truth functionality. It's something different,
Right.
right? Um, I suspect that Hegel would say that infinite judgments cannot be contained by the sphere of reason.
Yeah.
Although I'm not entirely sure because reason's kind of everything and spirit is everything. So maybe at some higher level of synthesis, these infinite judgments are contained. I suspect with Maimon, at least, in his formulation of it, they're not contained in the sphere of reason. There's something
Yeah.
other than reason.
Yeah. Yeah. The thread is clear though now for me that to get out of the sphere of reason, you need to first be situated in it. And I can see how the affirmation first, you need the affirmation first
Mhm.
before you can break the sphere of reason and create the infinite judgment. Because
Mm,
if I were to hypothetically imagine someone positing the infinite judgment as the first primordial,
mm.
yeah, it seems like it's almost impossible or something.
Well, if you, yeah, yeah, maybe what you're saying is, if you want a critique of reason, you have to take some form of reason as an axiom.
Yeah.
I mean, um, and that's true of most of these various critiques of reason, either the critique of pure reason or like I'm thinking of Wittgenstein's Tractatus or whatever, where you, or Kierkegaard too, where you try to explore or define the limits of reason, but you have to do that from within reason or from within language,
Yeah.
right? How can you talk about the limits of language without language? You
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. But let's get back to this idea of these material expressions. And
Hmm.
now, given all that kind of groundwork, I think it should be fairly clear why crime or death would be examples in a material expression of the negative infinite judgment.
Yeah. Um, well, in order to posit death, I guess you first need life. So that I'm thinking of as an affirmation. And then let's say the negation is death.
Can,
Well,
can I just can I just suggest that it's a lot easier to think about it starting with crime instead of death?
oh, it's a crime.
I think
Yeah.
it's easier.
Um,
For one thing, crime
mhm.
and law are a lot closer to logic and reason than life and death. It's not quite as obvious what the connection is.
Yeah. So if I, let's say, commit a murder, I'm trying to think of it as an example. Um,
So maybe we should start with civil law, first of all, and not criminal law.
okay.
Because the problem is crime is already the infinite judgment. So you're trying to start with the infinite judgment. You got to start with an affirmative and a negative judgment.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying? So you got to start with the system of civil law first,
Yeah.
including a contest, a discussion, an argument about what rights people have or what they don't have.
Mm.
In other words, right there, I've shown you an affirmation and negation. If I say, uh, I don't know, I own this toy train,
Hmm.
it's mine, so I have a right not to be deprived of it for no good reason by you. In other words, you
Yeah.
can't steal this from me. I have
Yeah.
that right. Now,
Yeah.
you could say, oh, you know what? Private property shouldn't exist for all sorts
Mm.
of reasons. And you give a logical defense of that. Now you
Hmm.
have negated my right, but it's still
Yes.
within the sphere of civil law.
Yeah.
But if I say, this is my train, I have a right to it, and I give you my logical defense for that, if instead of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have a society with private property, you just take it,
Yeah. Or I kill you or something,
or
then
you kill
it's,
me, or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. You perform some action that is an affront to my rights, but not a negation, understood as a legal defense for an opposing viewpoint.
mm.
Now you have committed a negative infinite judgment because what you've just done is in not negating whether it's true that I have that right or whether I should have that right or something, you have simply disrupted or in fact destroyed or punched a hole in the sphere of civil law itself,
Yeah.
right? In other words, there are kind of two ways to negate my claim to having a right to own this thing. You can either say, no, there's a rational reason. I have a reason to deny that you have that right. Or you can deny it by disrupting the very sphere within which those kinds of claims can be made,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. And so there is exactly the same structure, right? And it has to do with whether, I mean, now you could say, well, maybe I have a reason to take it or something like that. Even so, you didn't give the reason, right?
Yeah.
You simply performed the action without the reason.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I was going to say something else and it slipped my mind now. But that gives you an idea, perhaps. Oh, yes, I do remember. Hegel says something like, even though crime in this case has something like the sense of the infinite judgment, it's not, it doesn't have truth in the way
Mm.
that a negation might have truth, right? Like you might say, you don't have the right to do this, and here are the reasons. That might be true. However, the stealing does have a kind of aptness. It does have a kind of correctness. In other words, it's effective,
Mm,
right? And so there is one way of seeing the way that the sphere of civil law has been ruptured is by bringing something that is would be an ill-formed formula.
mm-hmm,
Like it's not a logical utterance, but it does have maybe some other kind of rule-governed quality to it.
mm-hmm.
However, it's not the right kind of property or not the right kind of quality for the sphere of legal discourse. And so you get the same kind of category mistake there.
Right. Yeah, there's no common ground. It's almost like spirit is red when you commit that sort of a crime where you there's no like common like context between the crime and the whatever
Yeah.
is within the
I mean,
sphere
you
of.
could look at this in a maybe more local situation too. Let's say we're playing chess or checkers or something, right?
Yeah.
And you're losing because I'm so good, or maybe I'm losing. I'm bad, and you're the one who's winning. And I'm okay. There are two ways I can prevent my loss. I
Mm,
can either play the game by its rules, or I could flip over the the chessboard, or I could just start playing some other game that doesn't follow the same rules or whatever. But the point is, in either of those cases, I have effectively negated the sphere of the game,
yeah.
but not in a way that is rule governed within the sphere. It's not
Mhm.
true because it's not rule governed by the sphere,
Yeah.
but it is effective
Yeah.
because it's bringing some other category to play in a sphere where that category that I'm bringing in is not well formed for the sphere,
Right.
right? So yeah, that's what's going on with crime. It's a little more complicated to talk about death, but it has to do with this idea that there's something rational about um, biology and organic life and the capacity to heal and reproduce and all this kind of stuff. And so, like, if I get cut, the negation, so maybe the cut is a negation to my health, but then it's still within the sphere of the
Life.
of life because it can heal,
Yeah.
whereas death is a cessation of that entire sphere of life.
Yeah.
And so that's where he gets that as well.
It's kind of almost anti-Buddhist or something.
How's that?
Oh, I'm just thinking of how life, I mean, how death is not viewed as like a cessation of life, and uh, there's
Oh, I
sort of
see.
like two sides of the same coin, and
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah. Yeah. I think that even if it's two sides of the same coin, you could probably still have a similar kind of I don't know. I don't know enough about um well, first of all, there I'm not sure that the theory of reincarnation is the same in like all of the strains
mm,
of Buddhism and everything. But in any case, like I know a little bit about Mahayana Buddhism, and I suppose just by virtue of the fact that it's two aspects to a phenomenon,
mm,
existence, I guess, or something. I don't know. I mean, because I suppose, let's say that you're a Hegelian and you believe in something like an afterlife. And so death isn't really death because now you get to start your afterlife.
yeah.
But it still is a cessation of organic life as a sphere,
Hmm.
right? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That there is a kind of logic to the way life is expressed in organisms that is not captured either in well, either in reincarnation as a structure where there's something independent of the lives that you're reincarnated as. In other words, what I mean by that is like there's the whole like system of different types of reincarnation and different paths you can take in reincarnation and so on, right? Which means that reincarnation as a complex is distinct from any of its manifestations in a life because
Hmm.
there's this other higher order rule about how you get reincarnated and
Hmm.
whatnot, right?
Hmm.
Um, but within any of those forms of life, any of those reincarnations, there is also its own sort of local logic that would be
Hmm.
disrupted by death,
Yeah.
right? So I think you could probably keep this. I think it's probably compatible
Yeah. Hegel. Yeah.
with Hegel. Yeah. Um, so let's see. We wanted to talk a little bit about, yeah, we talked about the collapse of uh, the judgment because, infinite judgments, um, they either disrupt the sphere as a category error or they kind of collapse into a tautology,
Yeah.
right? And then in both cases, uh, judgment ceases to sort of produce new knowledge, right? There's a kind of collapse. And so, but spirit continues in its development towards self-identity at a higher level where it's no longer self-identity understood in predicative terms, where
Yeah.
the predicate is distinct from the subject, um, but rather where the predicate is really, I suppose, just another aspect of the subject. The subject gives concrete form to the universal as predicate, but the universal as predicate is also the essence of the singular, right? That's where we're going after the collapse of the judgment. Is it clear what I just said?
Not the last part where the universal predicate is
You remember how
is-
he's talking about I think the example in the book is God is being, and he says in that judgment, this is a judgment where it has a kind of self-identity to it. It's
yeah,
not tautological in the way that the positive infinite judgment is. In other words, just completely uninformative.
yeah,
Of course, God equals God or spirit equals
yeah,
spirit because anything equals itself.
right.
But that's not really what's going on in the sort of concrete universal formulation of God is being, because God gives concrete form to the universal predicate being. And so the universal isn't different from the singular.
Yeah,
It's kind of like two different ways of looking at the same thing.
yeah,
And this idea is that there's a sense in which the singular becomes identical with the universal.
yeah.
I think one way I described it last time was like if you go back to the earlier section where he's talking about an affirmative judgment, the rose is red. That's like a really weak and incomplete identity statement
Mm,
because obviously the rose isn't identical to red.
yeah,
And then even if you could list out all the properties of the rose, it still wouldn't be identical to those properties because there's something more to the subject. In other words, it unifies its properties and so on. Uh, and with something like God as being, now we have a situation where the predicate essentially expresses the same thing, but kind of from a different aspect as the subject term,
hmm,
because the singular and the universal, in becoming identical in this way, there's like a perfect fit. Um, when I say that God is being and being is just the essence of God, so that if I just say being, that's kind of identical to God at that level. There's nothing left over from
mm,
being. There's no extra unity that I need to list or something like that. But there is something kind of defective about it, which is that it no longer has this kind of concrete singularity to it.
mm,
It's just like universal being,
hmm,
right? So that's why it still needs the formulation in the singular God.
yeah,
But God likewise is just sort of a shorthand for saying being,
hmm,
right? That is to say,
hmm,
the essence of God, God is nothing other than being. So, the universality of being populates the subject term God. But sorry, I'm getting lots of phone calls. But it populates it as its essence.
mm,
Uh, but the subject term also gives kind of concrete definition to the universal term,
hmm,
right? And so they're in this kind of distinct unity or something, right? There's this sense that they both contain the judgment contains, or it's not a judgment anymore, I suppose, but the thought or whatever contains both this element of distinctness,
Yeah.
but the elements of the uh, distinction are perfectly unified with each other.
Hmm.
That's kind of the idea. And it is fairly mystical in
Yeah.
thinking because we can't really pick that apart by using judgment because judgment has collapsed at that
Yeah.
point. But it's this idea that the singular term, in this case, God, becomes identical with its predicates in a way that's not just a pure tautology,
Yeah.
that is not informative, but rather, it's sort of like if you just take like a dual aspect approach to it, it's one and the same thing, but you can look at it from different perspectives, the universal aspect or the concrete aspect,
Hmm.
right? It's
Hmm.
something like that. Um, yeah, I mean, he does give this kind of interesting account for he gives a summary of the phenomenology of spirit, where spirit is discovering itself first through kind of like logic and reason and whatnot, and then into the empirical sciences and so on, and keeps trying to find itself in material forms, including phrenology. You know what the phrenology is?
No.
It's a totally like 19th century science. It's where they tried to study consciousness and psychology by looking at the structure of the skull.
Oh, I see.
And so it leads to this formulation where spirit sees itself as nothing but a bone. In other words, I mean, phrenology is not really a science anymore, but psychology kind of tries to do the same thing, right? Which is to say, reduce reason and consciousness and everything to a few chemicals in the brain, and well, not a few. I mean, like
Yeah.
millions and billions of synapses,
Hmm.
connecting and all this kind of stuff. But in any case, I mean, still trying to find there's still a sense where on a physicalist understanding of the brain, you say something like spirit is like fat, or whatever the material
Yeah.
substrate of the brain of consciousness is, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually kind of a category mistake, right? And that's
Hmm.
the height of self-alienation because
Mm.
spirit's not a bone.
Yeah.
It's nonsense in a way to say that spirit is a bone. Um, but in that moment of self-externalization, that's where I guess I don't remember how he gets from there to absolute knowing, but that form of self-alienation has to be overcome
Mm.
by returning to spirit itself as a phenomenon instead of just being explained in terms of material phenomena or something like that, I think. Yeah. But in any case, this idea of the concrete universal as the singular and the universal coming into this unity that nonetheless respects its difference. You remember how last
Yeah.
time I said something like Hegel wants to make reason necessarily dynamic, necessarily a process, which
Hmm.
means that um, at some, if there is a final synthesis, it can't be a kind of Platonic synthesis where there is no more difference.
Mm.
Is it clear what I'm saying there? Like, well, let me know first of all if it's clear what I'm saying.
Like a so Platonic synthesis, as in like some sort of a fixed,
Yeah, a fixed truth.
immutable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, something like that. I mean, sorry, I gotta take a call. I let me just pause this for a second and then I will be right
All
with
right.
you.